okay, so it's the idea of optimal distance for each of the instincts. And there's a close and a distant variation for all the instincts.
They can make somebody who's dominant, like a dominant social type, very in one person, very different from a dominant social instinct in another person, and even of the same type or different types or whatever.
The white thing cannot be overstated. The racial element to dating is something that I've had to come to terms with.
How social perceptions or social instincts interfere with sexual selection.
Yes.
The big hormone enneagram.
I'm John Lekovich, 415, sexual self-pres, 458 trifix.
I'm David Gray, self-pres sexual, 9 with 1 wing, 974 trifix.
What up, it's Emeka. I'm an 8-wing 7, sexual self-pres with 854 fixes.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm a 3-wing 4, self-pres social, a 369 trifix.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. I'm a social self-preservation 9-wing 1, 963 trifix.
If you like or hate us, make sure you go like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and make sure you leave us a review.
Welcome to the Emeka and John Enneagram Show. This is what happens when your friends desert you and think they got more important shit to do than to sit around and talk about the Enneagram. This is what you get. You get two social blind hexa types trying to have a conversation. We actually ended up having a pretty interesting conversation. This is what happens when I don't have to hear David or Nancy or Alexandra yapping all the time. I get to really hear myself. That's the really important thing about this show, is to hear myself. So before we get into this amazing show that we had, let me hit you with our usual plugs. The Instinctual Drives in the Enneagram, John's book. If you've been living under a rock and you're not aware of the only instinctual Bible in existence, you need to get on Amazon or wherever you buy books from. You can find John's book on the instincts. Secondly, Josh and John started an Enneagram school earlier this year. Their first course, getting into the object relations, Josh's new object relational theory of the centers. It's a 6-part course. They even get into trifix. What's really unique about the school is that it's creating a community of people who not only want to learn the Enneagram, but how to work with the Enneagram for inner work. So check that out at theenneagramschool.com. And then DAA, Dark Arts Academy. You want to become dangerously perceptive and skilled at being able to see the types clearly. Because, what's the point of knowing the Enneagram if you're just mistyping people left and right? If you can't tell what type your boss is, your partner, or knowing people in your family, what's the point of knowing the Enneagram if you can't use it, apply it to the people in your life correctly? Recently, we've been looking at some trifixes. We've done Bermuda and DJ. We did a class recently on Jim Morrison. That was interesting. And we've got a class coming up soon on Flatline, 359 trifix. We're also announcing that we're going to finally start a Discord server for DAA. So if you're a member of DAA, be on the lookout for an email about that coming up soon. And if you have been typed by us, you can get all this information at enneagrammer.com. You want to understand your typing better, the DAA library has so many classes that compares and contrasts different types, different fixes, different instinctual stacking. So you can get a whole education from our past video, from our library of content. And then we've got David's Trifix booklet. It's a illustrative, archetypal exploration of the trifixes. It's got an intro by John. It's got some interesting images. David's razzle-dazzle descriptions are there. Lots of people enjoy it. You can get it at enneagrammer.com/store. And then Alexandra is the world's leading and only Enneagram and astrology expert. She's got a website, Saturn Ruled 9, SaturnRuled9.com. where you can book a session to explore in what ways your astrological chart and Enneagram typing combine. All right, I think that's it. So enjoy the show, Emeka and John. You're very welcome. What else do you need in life besides just two of us? Who are we kidding?
Yeah, the cultural thing is really important because, I mean, we've touched on it different ways, but there's just so many ways that, like, 9, for example, being adaptable, they're going to adapt to the culture they're in. And so if Americans are very conflict avoidant and like easily get their feathers ruffled, and like Americans for as belligerent in kind of in a certain attitudinal style they are, they're also like deeply unprepared for anybody to say no to them. And so you do learn that just to kind of be polite is a way to get, just to not shock everybody's nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in the Middle East, in Latin countries, in Africa, I assume, it's just people aren't so like, they don't tremble so much.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like a boundary or a direct statement doesn't like seemingly penetrate them and then like obliterate them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've talked about this with the instincts and different like weather patterns and what the warm temperatures, how that might influence the way people, what relationship people have to certain instincts. And I wonder, I saw something the other day about capitalism and the nuclear family, how, like I mean, I think we had a discussion about like parenting and how it seems like such a daunting task because it's a lot for a couple to handle. Whereas, I mean, growing up in Nigeria, like it's just normal that you're around so many people. You're around your grandma, you're around, your uncles and aunts. We had 2 maids. It's not uncommon to have maids because like they were kind of like distant cousins who my dad was paying through school. And so while my parents were at work, I had like these 2 young, teenage girls who were helping raise us. So it's just like, it felt like there was just so many people to help. Right. And so when you think about parenting, it's in most places in the world, it's a community job. It's not just a nuclear family. So in the West, you have this idea of a nuclear family and it's all on these 2 people to raise this person. Yeah, like capitalism and cold weather and how that changes the way people relate to each other. Like the white West way of being is so different.
Totally.
It's so fucking different that it took me a long time to realize this, just how some of the issues that I've had in dating is just like this not understanding that there isn't any sort of concept of real talk.
Yeah. No, that's actually been very helpful. You mentioned that one time the white people don't have real talk.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, oh my God, like that was some key for me to understand. And to be like, I remember I was explaining to somebody, a white friend of mine, about this because I was like, we need to be able to have a real talk conversation,
Right.
but we don't even have the idea of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally.
I mean, there's a kind of like a cultural clash with our group because
totally.
Like there are multiple angles you can look at this, but like sort of the green level approach to the Enneagram, where it's like your subjective experience of yourself is valid, and to sort of like bring yes, your subjective experience is valid, but there is also kind of an objective structure to this thing. Right. And how that can be so jarring to people to tell them, hey, you are this type here, or you are this, we see you as this type based on these observations. That in itself, it's not saying we're telling you who you are. You can decide to be whoever the fuck you are. But the fact that I'm invalidating your subjective experience with my observations is like a crime to so many people.
Yeah.
And it took people a long time to get used to us. But I mean, for a long time, the not a fourth thing was just like a sense of people feeling like we were invalidating their personhood.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's cultural. I think we have a lot of international fans that don't have that issue, like people from Europe, I mean, of course, people still have this issue, but it feels like, Middle Easterns and Europeans that I've talked to are very more comfortable with our sort of bluntness. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And what I was speaking to a little bit before with like, all right, like if 9 is super adaptable, yet all these textbooks define 9 as like super conflict avoidant.
Mm-hmm.
And like I've coached people all over the world, different cultures and stuff, and not like every huge sampling, but enough. And in some cultures 9s are super conflict avoidant, but in others, they're adapting and like they're what are Josh and I's way of speaking? It's like that the exogenous influence just is in their system. They're just not, they're very direct, they're very blunt and whatever. And so it kind of is like, how do you define 9 in a way that applies to all 9s all over the world? Like what is 9ness apart from the way it expresses itself through a cultural filter?
Yeah, it's because I think you mentioned something about how if people are really sensitive to real talk in this part of the world, then the 9s are going to reflect that, because the 9s sort of are representing the equilibrium for any social space, because whatever might destabilize the dynamic is what a 9 will avoid doing. So if the dynamic, because if you go to like a Nigerian party, like the volume level is so many decibels higher, so like if you put a 9 in that environment, it's like the level of chaos or is that they feel more that they can say and do whatever they want without like being out of the norm.
Right.
So you experience 9s you take a 9 from that part of the world and you compare them to a 9 from the West, and it's like, how is that the same type?
I mean, even a 9 in New York versus a 9 in like
there you go.
Minnesota,
East Coast versus like Midwest or West Coast, like
right.
So that's something I think about a lot. I was thinking about, with respect to the instincts and how, like I do think that you're born with your type and so forth, but there's a huge environmental, cultural aspect to this where, for example, the other day I was just thinking how insane it is. Like something that people who were born here will never really, ever really understand is that regardless of how poor you are, you always have access to food.
Uh-huh.
You always have access to more than enough food in this country. Like you can't starve. You can go to a food bank and get a box of free groceries.
Mm-hmm.
That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so much abundance that, I mean, let me like to help you understand, like growing up in Nigeria, we were middle class. But middle class in Nigeria, in some ways, is still poorer than poor in the US in terms of your access to just food. So like growing up in Nigeria, I mean, like what we would eat is like, my mom would make like a soup that like, the soup that you've had, make a huge batch of it and then make like a stew. And then every day you're either eating some pounded thing, not like pounded yam. Pounded yam is like luxury, but some other pounded thing that's not.
I love that fufu.
Yeah, pounded fufu or something. And then rice. And you get like one, because you'd have like lunch would be like maybe peanuts and water at school. Breakfast would be like the mai, but like not as tasty as the shit that you had. So just thinking about like, those are basically 2 meals, 2.5 meals. And the meal that you have is just like rice or fufu. And it's not great. Like that's it. That's all you get. So this idea of snacks and like, social events are a big deal. Weddings, birthday parties, because that's when you really get to eat. That's when they kill a chicken, you get more meat. Like all the meat that you would see would be like a little ounce, of meat per day. And that's all the meat. And so coming here, it's like a huge culture shock just to see the abundance of food. And I just remember like when my uncles would come back from the States or from Europe, and they'd bring back snacks and they'd bring back like peanut butter and jelly. And like peanut butter and jelly, because you get access to a snack like that. You're just like eating as fast as you can. Because you like you're
yeah.
And so even till this day, there is there is like a deep-rooted appreciation for food that I cannot explain.
I know you've really
You know, like,
you
it's
and
still-
David when you guys look at a menu, it is like it is an event.
Well, but here's the thing, because David is a self-pressed type, so that makes sense for him. But for me, it's like there is kind of like a fixation here that will never go away, where because of my life experience, that it doesn't matter as long as I'm in this country, I will never feel poor. In the sense that the fact that I can go to Trader Joe's or some fucking grocery store and buy pretty much what I want, like, and they're like, I was like, I don't know what I was eating the other day. I was just like, oh my God, this is so good.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm 39. It's still like that every single time. And that's because like, I know what it's like to not have that ever for 10 years, you know?
Yeah.
So I was thinking how there can be, depending on what you're, you know, how you grew up, there can be a certain, I don't want to say fixated, but a certain relationship to the instincts.
No, I totally, absolutely agree with you. And I think there can be, you know, it gets really nuanced because I think people could easily, you know, one of the things we always see when we talk about type with people, especially people who are struggling to come to their own type, and you know, you're maybe seeing this instinct or that type really clearly in them, and they're not seeing it. Is that terminology and concepts, like when you don't have like a really solid grasp of them, can easily be like reappropriated for basically whatever your agenda is. So for example, if you want to see yourself as a 4, you'll take, oh, I'm very idiosyncratic, and you'll just run with that own version of it because in some ways everybody is, but it's held in a different way in a type 4 version, you know, whatever. So like one of the things I want to talk about when everybody's on the pod is the idea of like how we make a religion out of our dominant instinct.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of that so-called religious influence like gets in there super early, you know, given the vibe of our early milieu, you know, our early holding environment. And like, I don't feel like I've had enough exposure to just sexual types in general to have a very good sense of how that might happen.
Yeah.
In the sexual instinct, but like in social and self-pres, I can see it much more clearly because there's so much more samples where like, you know, there are some social types that are super warm and personal and personable and like to be around people and engage. There's others that are really withdrawn and aloof and, you know, cold. Some social types seem to be more about like their position or standing rather than actual connection.
Yeah.
Some are much like could not give a shit about their position and are just very connection in person oriented.
Yeah.
Some, I mean, like Alexandra is as a social type is like very more like removed in a lot of ways, and then like in private, you know, we call her love monster. You know, she's like needs a like I thought. You know, 4s, some circles associate 4 with like intimacy, and I get that because there's a whole heart thing that's very personal,
right?
But Alexandra, her social 9ness is intimacy monster. Like she just she wants the intimacy so bad, and it's all about that. And it's just really funny because I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but you know, with like a social 9, like a lot of social 9s end up settling for a kind of like a lack of intimacy, basically, because it's like the attachment, like to keep the connection. I can't go for what I really want is like what sloth kind of represents. So I'll settle for this.
Right.
And so it's an interesting thing, like in just considering, you know, whether it's cultural, whether it's individual, whatever, this way that the expression of instinct is so much, on one hand, it's so obvious, but on the other hand, it's so nuanced.
Right.
And requires a lot of unpacking of our assumptions of not only how the instincts work, but how human beings work.
Yeah.
You know, you're speaking to families, and, you know, one of the things that came up was, like, I've always been a little political because of my dad's profession, you know?
Right.
But I got really more systems political because of the research I did for the instinct book. And I was just reading all this stuff about human beings before agriculture and how prehistoric humans lived and what they adapted and how they spent their time. And it was like, it was shocking to read over and over again just how basically like laid back and fucking all the time and interconnected. Not maybe all humans, but like, I mean, most humans for thousands and thousands and thousands of years lived in very tight-knit groups where there was a lot of shared sexuality and shared parenting, which is called alloparenting. So your point about nuclear family.
Yeah.
Like a lot of, I'll shut the fuck up in a second, but
It's all good.
a lot of anthropologists studied chimps and other kinds of primates to understand human parenting. And but they were kind of like looking at the wrong apes, because one thing that chimps do is like when you see those baby chimps that are clinging to their mothers,
right?
Humans don't do that, and humans actually show a parenting system more like a certain kind of gibbon, which is like like very not human like ape, but like where the gibbons will let other mothers hold their children and kind of like co-parents and stuff.
Yeah.
You see that in the way that like I don't know, just the human nervous system operates. It's like humans are just like you were kind of earlier kind of getting down on yourself about not being more proactive on things or on top or hustling more or something. And
Sure,
yeah. Humans did not fucking hustle as much as we like to pretend they did. So yeah, it's so many variables, and the container that we're in culturally now really fucks with our quote unquote natural instincts.
Yeah. There's a lot of directions to go there, but I do remember. I don't know if you remember this, but you had posted something in the old BHE chat about like these different variable relationships to the instincts. I think like with the sexual instinct, like close. I might have it saved somewhere.
Yeah, I remember something like that.
Let me look that up, because
Cool.
I want to read it. Because I thought it was. I wondered if you would include it in your book, but it probably didn't.
No, I don't think I did.
Probably didn't make it. But I think people have always kind of questioned, or there've been multiple theories posed about like those different stackings or different variations on the stackings. And I don't necessarily think that anyone had anything that was really good, but I think what you came up with, at least, was kind of a beginning of something that could be used, like a close versus distant variation on
something like that.
Let me see if I can find it. So I'm definitely on the distant side. So it's like, it feels like I can do, all right, we come together and we have this thing and it's great. And then I need you to get the fuck away from me. Like, I need distance. And so there's this back and forth. And so for someone who's codependent, it just creates more codependency.
Yeah.
There is this sense of being needed from a distance that I've been figuring out, like, like being able to provide something, but not joined at the hip.
Yeah.
That's my optimal distance. Like, I want you to kind of want me a few days a week, like to really need me a few days a week. I don't want you to need me 7 days a week.
Yeah.
That's way too much.
Yeah. So what, I feel stupid asking this, but what is the idea that I had that we're
okay,
like,
all right.
because there's things that are coming up, but I want to kind of frame it.
Okay. All right. I found my notes. So,
what, Emeka, tell me my idea.
Yeah. The social drives. So some people so it's the idea of optimal distance for each of the instincts. And all right, maybe I'll just read this whole thing. Yeah, it's funny just like how watching sort of how your knowledge about this stuff evolved, because you were figuring it out and you were just dumping all this stuff on forums. So like your like sexual instinct definition has changed over the years. But some of them I like better than some of the ones you're using. So it's interesting how the different ways you frame it, it's just depending on the language.
Yeah, sometimes I frame it differently than like I actually think, because I know the way that I present it is going to be misunderstood.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's always like kind of a funny thing, because I know like I'm overemphasizing certain things, because I'm like, well, this is the only way that somebody who's like sexual blind will understand sexual instinct versus how maybe I might understand it in my own whatever.
All right, so when object relations color are instinctual drives, is my sense that each instinct will be related to a particular stage in ego development, and it will be trying to work out through adult relationships. And so for sexual drive, it's not a mellow interpersonal fusion drive. Any aim or effort to fuse or lose oneself is quickly met by a desire to separate again, followed by a drive to fuse, followed by a drive to separate, etc. So the social drive becomes constellated around the achievement of optimal distance, a compromise a young child makes when they are close enough to be in a relationship with mom and get their love and help, and yet separate enough to be reflected by her and maintain acceptance, distance, and independence from her. So for some people, optimal distance is quite impersonal and remote. For others, it translates into a closeness and care. I think this is why some people strong and social can seem really impersonal, while others can seem more towards warm and intense. So you're going to attach to someone who corresponds to your inner map of how close or distant and what kind of emotional affect was present when we negotiated optimal distance. I think this is one of the most important things. I'm not sure why you haven't developed this further, because I'm like, this is a pretty big deal.
Is that all right? So I'm on that document. Is this on?
If you just search optimal distance, you'll find it.
Okay. All right. Some people. Okay. Yeah, I got it.
So for sexual, the drive to find one's novel, energizing ends up attracting us to the kinds of people who recapitulate our history. It's the same old shit in disguise of novelty. Where do you talk about the close and the distant variations of sexual? But it's kind of the same idea. Like there's a close and a distant variation for all the instincts. And
yeah, maybe I can like break down for the pod listeners like some of what this is, and then maybe you can find the thing that I actually said those things on. Yeah. So yes, this is like when I was writing my book, I just came up with a bunch of ideas, and only some got back into the book, and a lot didn't. And I wanted to focus in the book more on like the overarching relationship of the instincts to inner work and to the overall type structure. And I didn't get as typey as maybe I should have, but I just was like exhausted. So this is idea that in my book I talk about how the instincts develop according to different psychological stages, and that the way those stages are navigated or resolved can result in somewhat different expressions or preferences around the instincts that can make somebody who's dominant, like a dominant social type, very in one person, very different from a dominant social instinct in another person, and even of the same type or different types or whatever.
This would be worth doing an entire episode on. I think it's people would really enjoy it, and unless you have any plans for it, but this would be.
I think this would be a good kick in my butt anyway. For the sexual drive, it's not a mellow interpersonal fusion drive. Any aim or effort to fuse or to lose oneself is quickly met by the drive to separate again.
Oh, I think I already read that.
Yeah, I was actually, somebody recently asked me, what's the difference between nines merging and sexual instinct merging? And it was a good question, and I answered it based on like Josh and I's theory of the way that nine gets washed out by their environment versus the sexual drive to like throw down boundaries that are that reconstitute themselves once again. But that's like a thing that like she sent me an article some other Enneagram teacher had written that was like, the merging in the sexual instinct is like getting really involved in a piece of music, things like this.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
It was another. It's just like turning sexual into an intensity or passion drive. But
right.
But yeah, this like this thing that'll be important for anybody to understand is like sexual is there's a drive to merge and fuse, but it's like immediately coupled by a drive to separate.
Yeah.
So it's very much like the intensity to have an orgasm, and then you're like, post-nut clarity.
Okay, I think the part that I was looking for, I don't think I have in this document. It was, I think I'd asked you a question and you responded and I saved it somewhere else. So let me read that. So yes, some sexual are more fusion-y. Some are more separation-oriented. Fusion wants to fuse, sometimes less intense, more sensual, more seductive.
Mm.
and then some are more separation and activation oriented. You use yourself an example. And then socials, some are highly warm and interpersonal, optimal distance was a close distance, and some are remote and impersonal, very hierarchical, political, elite. It's how object relations were negotiated, and no matter the stack, it shows up in all instincts. And so I find that really interesting. Maybe there's something that we can design based on this to help people figure out what their optimal distance for each of the instincts. But I was thinking in my last relationship that what was weird was like, so like each relationship has its own instinct stacking or instinct, because of the relationship between those two people creates some weird meeting point or whatever. And I was thinking how like that relationship became very self-prezi in the sense that, she's self-pres blind, but there was this kind of like, I want to just saturate in appetite, food, music, and sex, and not go anywhere. And I have this sort of self-prezi food, like, thing. And so that was one aspect of that relationship that worked really well, was this kind of like, this is a self-pres blind person who just wants to just sit at home and just eat and fuck and just consume food. And it felt very self-prezi. And I was just thinking about how, regardless of one's instinct stacking, there can be certain instincts that get overemphasized for whatever reason, for whatever life, experience that one might have. And then you get into a relationship with someone where you link up in that way, and that relationship takes on that instinct, even though that's not, I'm not self-pres type and she's not a self-pres type either. So that, I thought that was interesting.
I think, like I've known some self-pres blinds who are real like food oriented. And what I think is going on, at least in some of these people, is that there's just like being self-pres blind, there's not a lot of self-holding.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of self-holding. And so like food becomes something that represents holding and care and relationship. And so, I know somebody who's self-pres blind who eats expensive, a lot of food with a lot of service and stuff like this. And they are always complimenting the kind of care that the place gives and provides and stuff. And I think it's like, especially when it's food that is not prepared themselves. I think that someone else preparing it and offering it, it's like very much, it's nourishment very much tied into relationship rather than nourishment kind of about managing the body in some way. And so I've noticed that with some, like there's this kind of, this is another way holding is provided, in the way, from other people though. That's kind of like there's like a little bit of baby bird with the mouth open kind of thing,
right,
going on.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. While you were speaking, I think I just realized something that, chemistry is this weird organism that gets created between two people, and it's kind of like trying to find what parts of you hook into this other person. At least my personality is trying to figure out like, how do we link up? Like, what are the activating points for us? And so looking at this description thing that you wrote, like, it would seem to me that if two people are attracted to each other or they experience chemistry, that it's an alignment with a certain relationship or optimal distance to a certain instinct. So let's say I meet someone, like my last relationship, someone who's self-pres blind, maybe because we both have the comfort-seeking, indulgent relationship to self-pres, that's where we sort of, that's where all the blood goes. The blood goes to this aspect of our dynamic because we both are aligned in that way. Maybe we have oppositional relationship to the sexual instinct, and that's where we have conflict. And so the relationship then takes on a more self-pres focus because this is where we both reinforce each other.
Because Another thing that I had thought about and kind of worked on just a little bit was, like love languages, like touch or whatever. I think that there's probably more than that are based on instinct that can be discerned. And so, so for listeners, I guess, like this early idea I had was that you see some people use their self-pres, and I don't just mean self-pres dominance, but like some people using their self-pres instinct, and it's got more of a independent, survivalist, DIY kind of thing. And some are more about like holding and comfort and indulgence and sensuality and things like this. And, some people might argue, oh, that's self-pres social versus self-pres sexual, but I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I've seen some very sensual self-pres socials and, very like literal survivalist self-pres sexuals.
Right.
And then with the sexual instinct, there's some sexual instinct that's this quality of being more fusiony, and others more separation. And so fusion wants to be more like connected, but it's not social. I'm trying to like, there's a sensual, there's a more, the tone is not as sharp. And I think a lot of, I do think as I've gotten to know sexual social better, I see a lot of sexual social in this.
Yeah.
There's more, it's more like an atmosphere of sparkliness or something like this, versus sexual that's more separation oriented, but it's also more like penetrating and then activated, and it's more of like the yang element of sexual.
The social aspect of dating is far stronger than anything else. And so race is, I saw a video the other day that drove this point home for me, because I still can't even hold on to this, but there was like a lineup of like 6 guys. So they had a lineup of 6 girls and a lineup of 6 guys. And so they asked the guys to rate themselves. So the guys rated themselves kind of based on like who was in best shape or who was tall. And so the first 3 guys were like pretty muscular and dressed pretty decent. And the last 3 guys were like nerdy, dweebs, whatever. And I looked at the list and I was like, yeah, I would maybe make one little change. But generally, yeah, that's when you look at guys, you're like, he's more built, he's taller, whatever. Like I would put him ahead of the other guy. Objectively, it seems more attractive.
Yeah.
So then the girls rated the guys, and the lineup was completely different. The first guy was, I mean, there were different races there. The first guy was the only white guy on the list, and he was the most nerdy. He looked like polo shirt, nerdy. Like there was nothing remarkable about him. He was like medium, average height. The white guy was the first guy.
Wow.
And
were these girls white or?
There was like mostly white. I think there was 3 white girls and then either Asian and. But I mean, this is something they've looked at. If you look at any sort of the data for dating apps, everyone's ideal, the ones that people respond to most to in terms of messages opened, are white people. I mean, but then again, white people dominate these apps. Like everyone's ideal partner is a white person, like the Asians in the. So if you're a white woman or guy, dating apps are great, would work out great. Whereas if you're not, you're fighting an uphill battle. And so the girls rated these guys. So the white guy was first. There was a black guy on the list, but he was one of the taller guys. And I put him like at mid-level, and just, he was dressed not dweeby, but he just looked normal. Like he was taller than everyone else. He was one of the top 3 taller guys. So he made sense to be like number 3. That guy was last.
Wow.
They put him last, and the white guy was first. And I think the next tallest guy was some version of white. And it was kind of one of those things like, oh, that had everything to do with perceived social status. And race is a big aspect of that.
Yeah.
But like the white thing cannot be overstated. The racial element to dating is something that I've had to come to terms with, because I've had to realize that being black, like some girls are looking at like, you have to be so exceptional. Like you have to be so good looking or famous for something. Whereas then you see like average white guy with like a pretty hot girl and you're like, why? He's not rich. He's not. And so there's a relative social standing with the races that doesn't make sense to me because, I mean, attractiveness is attractive. Like, you're attractive if you're attractive, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to explore more. Like, I mean, even though I am a white guy,
You're a weird white guy. You're not your standard issue white guy.
Right. But I experienced like total confusion in terms of like what girls what they're responding to in guys. Like, and I will think like, you know, like kind of like whatever these guys in this thing you're watching, like selecting, oh, this obviously this would be the guy that or whatever, this would be the feature, this would be whatever. And I'm always fucking wrong, and I'm always like yeah, just blown away by the choices some people make. Yeah. I can't, like being a white guy, I can't even imagine the the racial piece.
There's been like a trend on social media, like I don't know if it's a trend but I've just been showing up on my feed for some reason, but the female gaze versus the male gaze. And I find that really interesting because there is certain things that we as men assume that girls want, and then there's actually what girls want. And so a lot of like the weightlifting, get buff stuff is really for other guys.
Yeah.
Like, you'll see like the compliments that guys get when they get buff or get really muscular are from other men. Right. But what girls really want, the ideal physique that girls want, is this sort of like muscular but lean.
Yeah.
You know, like sort of model-esque athletic, you know, deal, and with some kind of edge. Like, there needs to be. And so like when it comes to facial hair, for example, guys will get these sort of like masculine beards. But girls tend to want the like shadow stubble look. And so there's all these different things that what girls respond to versus what guys think that they respond to. It's like, it's almost like you're trying to be impressive to yourself, but it's really only what guys would find impressive. Whereas what girls find impressive, you know, like, I find that really interesting. Like, the female gaze versus the male gaze.
Yeah.
But like I think about attraction as just brutal competition. This is nature. Like, it's about, at the end of the day, even something like race is only a thing because of the perceived social hierarchy of these different racial categories. And so girls are choosing white guys because there's more perceived social benefits to being white. Yeah, and so it's not even something to feel bad about. It's just like, I know that I've recognized that the context in which that one puts themselves, attractiveness is very heavily influenced by context. So me in a certain room full of white people, I could, like, in country bar, for example, I'm invisible. But I've gone to Mexico and like treat it very differently. Like, the context in the room that you're in and who's in it determines how attractive you are. And so that's something I've been really focused on. Like, it's so social. It's how you meet someone shapes how attractive they see.
Yeah. So like what I was kind of interrupting to like mention was, I think, going into how social perceptions or social instincts interfere with sexual selection.
Yes.
And the sexual instinct. Because I mean, you know, I think that's what a lot of couples face, is they chose each other for social reasons, and there's not enough sexual there or whatever. They got sexually excited for social reasons. And then I hadn't thought about context, but that's pretty interesting. And I remember before I'd written the book, when I was kind of really considering things and exploring things, I was hanging out with a friend who's social self-pres. And as we were walking, we were just like kind of remarking on things that we notice about like what's attractive. And she was very attentive to like clothes.
Yeah.
And she was like how people wear stuff and how they walk, but like what it says about their like social location and the way their hair is cut and stuff like this. And like that was a mind blower for me, because like, yeah, I'll notice clothes, but it's like, how does it enhance the energy, or you know what I mean, like basically how can I tell your body looks good or not in it, you know?
Right.
And it was really interesting because then I think I pressed her to like look at the bodies, and that took her a little bit to like adjust to that lens.
Yeah.
And I thought that was mind blowing because, you know, I like last night we went to a bar, Alexander and I, and you know, because I work from home, I don't see a lot of people. So then when I'm in public, I mean, I've always been a people watcher, but I really like am like staring at people, kind of.
Right.
You know, it's just like the anthropology of it, and
Right.
and you know, like at different bars, there's different crowds, which is interesting. So like Doris, which you've been to, you know, a couple times, like, you know, it definitely has a like people are good looking, but they're not like attractive. You know,
Yeah,
they're not.
yeah.
They're like they all seem like creative directors at an ad agency or something.
Right.
And so like you know, it's a fun bar, but it's like kind of a weird crowd. And like I was noticing like like what girls are talking about guys and why.
Yeah.
And like there were a bunch of guys dressed. You probably know this style, but they'll have like almost like an oversized shirt.
Yeah.
Usually it's a white guy with an oversized shirt. He's got a lot of tattoos usually.
Yeah.
You might have a mustache that is
God.
kind of ironic or not.
I know
you know?
exactly. Yeah, I know exactly what.
And then sometimes they have a hat that's like it almost looks like the kind of hat you wore to t-ball as a little kid. You know, it's got this kind of it has like a childish aesthetic to me. You know, it's like the clothings are loose and baggy, like you don't even care how they fit. But it's all like very much it signals a certain kind. Like there's a little Venn diagram overlap of like skater and creative director, and it's something that like I see girls talking to these kind of guys all the time, and I'm like you know, he's like hunched over, he's like skinny, but he's got a little belly, you know, and you're like, what is going on, you know? So yeah, it's like I always seen that or whatever.
Yeah, like I noticed that once my dread started growing in, that I recognized that I had now inadvertently positioned myself in a social genre that was trendy at the time. Like, you know, a lot of rappers, I think The Weeknd had dreads. And so I had a couple people who were like, oh, you look like The Weeknd. And so that was like an immediately, I mean, I'd get attention in bars even without the hair, but this was like a social hook.
Yeah.
And so that girl that I thought was a sexual 3 who turned out to be social 6, like she was really hooked into me being sort of like a Basquiat, you know, sort of. So she'd attached an attractive social archetype to me. And yeah, I find that so interesting. Like the fashion thing is very social because it's people are basically putting on social costumes. And it's like when something becomes trendy and people just dress that way, because it will get them attention. And a lot of people make their sexual decisions just based on the social genre that you represent. And so I've noticed that ever since we started the podcast, it's almost like we created our own context. And that's why I'm just like, I mean, there's multiple reasons why I don't use dating apps because I mean, I'm just not going to put myself in a losing position. That's a losing position for me. But like if you're an attachment type, like OD, who's social sexual 6, Bermuda, like people just like him. So there's no experiential blindness in where he fits in the social playing field. Like people understand, okay, creative guy, friendly. But when you're like a hexad type who's social blind, who's not playing any of these playing to any of these social genres, people don't know where to place you. You're not signaling any sort of status that places you in a respectable position. So they're just noticing, oh, you're hot, you're sexy, but you're not signaling anything that they find attractive. And so with this group, for example, we've created a context where around our personalities, where we're at the center of it. And so within this context, I'm socially attractive. not just sexually attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing I've come to realize is the context is everything. Like, okay, if you go to another country, for example, as an American, you have an exotic, social archetype that makes you attractive there. Like my experience, and like I started going out in Mexico, so that my experience there compared to here was like night and day. Just because I was a Black American in that country, which is associated with money. You do have more money than other guys. And so I got to experience what it was like to be a white guy.
Yeah.
Like in Mexico, and then you come back here and it's like, oh.
Yeah. Lewis?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We do sessions and stuff, and so he was in New York, and so I did an in-person breathwork with him.
Oh, nice.
And it was cool. Like, he's cool in person, and I know he does like all this fashion stuff, so I was just talking to him about his clothes and stuff, and he said something to me about like I made some comments about like how I don't think very much about what I wear. Like I'm like black pants and some kind of black shirt. I like a tank top or button-up shirt, and like I like leather jackets. And then he said something to me that was like, "Oh yeah, you kind of go for this like effortless masculine look." And
right.
And I was like,
yeah, categorizing it.
Yeah, categorize it in a way I've never thought of.
And that's correct. That's actually accurate too. Like that is what you go for.
Yeah, I didn't even, I didn't know that. Like I didn't consciously. I was just like, oh, I like this. I don't like this. And yeah, I feel like kind of silly if something looks a little too like froofy or like feminine or something. But that was, I don't know, that was like a little light bulb moment of just like, oh, this is a social lens,
Yes,
like,
yeah.
I just thought that was really interesting. It was just such a small phrase, but he just nailed it really fast, and it was just like, oh, yeah, I guess that is what this is, like.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I've asked like Joseph like to sort of like give me your like social impression of me, because I just notice people with social doing this across the board, or like even just saying like what type of girl or guy do you like, because there are these social categories that people slot themselves into. And so I was like, I don't have a neat category. I mean, but the thing is, if I force myself to look at the people that I've been attracted to, those categories are there. Maybe there's like 3 or 4 genres that are reoccurring or whatever. But it's like, are you doing that for yourself? And I've asked Joseph, like, where would you, from your impression of me, if you didn't know me, like, what are some of the social impressions you'd have? And he's like, oh, like you're a Black artist guy who has some kind of like masculine, feminine interplay energetically. And I was like, that seems right. Like, I mean, most people that don't know me assume that I'm involved in the arts of some kind. I remember like the most egregious one was some guy who didn't know me asked me like what music label I was working with or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so people immediately assume, I mean, because we know artists, I don't think I'm that weird, but to most people are just incredibly, fucking lame and normal. Like I seem like a wild person or a weird, super weird person. Maybe I'm just not seeing how weird I am. But most people assume that I'm an artist, or people assume that if they are inviting me to something that they need to include that there will be art involved or there's a gallery close by, because they assume that I require that.
I do like how your hair has become this sort of this whole swoop now. Like, it was getting kind of like crazy out here.
Yeah.
Now that it's kind of closer to your face, it like frames your face much better.
Yeah. Before, I mean, this thing is just, let's just see what the fuck my hair does, and we'll roll with it. It's just, I'm discovering what the fuck is going on. But I remember at some New Year's Eve party, some girl just like was staring at me, and she just like, I just really like how much you don't give a fuck. Like, I just want to not give a fuck as much as your hair. Like, you just don't care so much. And I'm poor. That's what that is. That's poverty.
Right,
that you're seeing.
I'm like, I won't buy a shirt for more than $30.
It's like, you have a job. I don't have one. This is over a decade of just not being employed. Okay.
Yeah.
You can experience this level of not giving a fuck when you don't have any money. But I mean, it does feel, oh man, I'm so deficient, in this sort of way of looking at things. It almost feels like, man, it's all social, because even sexual appeal has like a social, if somebody's good looking or attractive, it's in most people's mind, it's converted into some kind of social value. And so it feels like, oh man, I'm just so behind the eight ball in terms of signaling that I'm someone worth respecting.
Yeah.
To me, it just seems silly, because at the end of the day, it's like you need practical needs and you need fucking, sexual attractiveness or chemistry. But like a huge part of the game is just the social perception of where you're located.
I mean, one of the things of, being with Alexandra and her working through her sexual blindness and stuff like this is I always had the assumption that people just went for who they're attracted to, but there's actually a whole lot of fear and about who one is actually attracted to.
Yeah.
That people often don't go for who they're actually attracted to because there's fear, intimidation, things of the unknown, all this kind of stuff. This might be changing the topic a little bit, but something I was thinking about with this thing my idea that you showed me again with these polarities, I think when we feel like really safe, those polarities dissolve.
Okay.
Because in a sense, like looking at self-pres and getting kind of like survivalist versus sensual. I mean, sensual seems like it's relaxing, but it's like I need holding all the time.
Yeah.
And so, like when you can kind of like somebody who's on the sensual side of self-pres, when they can relax, they don't need so much holding, and they can kind of express their independent capacities. Somebody who because now in this relationship, I am very melty and fusy, and I like linger, and I'm really, I'm not just like wham bam, whatever.
Right.
It's like,
yeah.
I'm really there, and I like you were saying, like, oh yeah, I can't be involved in all this stuff, and I used to identify that way,
right,
and now I'm like all creamed out, and it's crazy because in Alexandra's language of astrology, she's always pointing to all my second house, blah 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 blah, which is all very sensual and stuff.
Yeah,
and all these other features on my chart, and just in my own experience, it's like I just feel like there's a certain way that in past relationships I was like a really narrow, like something narrow hole, narrow object or something. And now that I don't feel, now that there's more safety and there's more appreciation and there's more whatever and there's more traction, all these other things, it's like I've become this like melty bitch.
Yeah.
And so then Alexandra, like with this social dynamic too, of like some socials are very warm and interpersonal. Their optimal distance is close, and some are more remote and impersonal, very hierarchical, elitist. She was, by her own reporting, like has this distance thing and is kind of that aloof, like can't touch me, social self-pres thing. And as we were saying before, she's just like love monster, just like needs connection and involvement. And I mean, we're just next to each other on the couch, and she needs to like be right here.
Yeah.
And it's very cute, but it's like it's like, so she used to not feel safe. So
right.
She couldn't come out. And so I think that in a really safe relation, like, so there's like ways it gets constellated, and there's, to your point earlier about like, okay, maybe you and your ex had a certain doorway of engaging self-pres. Maybe that's how it showed up. But, I don't know. I'm going off, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think that's interesting. How a different relationship, depending on the safety and how seen you feel, what qualities that might bring out. Because I mean, like I realized that what I was doing was I was having one night stands, but I was, having fucking in a one night stand situation as if this is the last fuck I'll ever have, and this is the love of my life. Like it's almost like you feel safe because it's a stranger, and then it's all this pent up intimacy and love gets unleashed on this person, and they're like, "What the fuck was that?" I realized that was what I was, in hindsight, that's what I was doing. But because in a way, it did feel safe because it's like I don't know this person. There's no, to just let loose. And sometimes when you don't think that there's any hope of anything happening, is when you're the most open.
Yeah.
When something does happen.
So yeah, I appreciate because you've brought up this idea a couple times.
It's a good one. It's a really good one.
Yeah, it's making me want to go back because I've been working on this, like I put it aside for a while, but working on kind of like an overview of the Enneagram, like just an overview, kind of all in one place, and what I think are the most interesting and meaningful parts of it and stuff like this, and kind of like a book that's like, all right, there's so much dirt and shit, like this is where I think you should look at, and this is what I think you should ignore. And so like
a replacement for the
it's like Wisdom of the Enneagram,
Wisdom
but
of the Enneagram,
a little bit more like boom boom boom, and a little bit more like here's the overall thing.
Right.
Now that like we've got the Enneagram to a certain degree, let's move on to more interesting stuff instead of like yoga for babies or Enneagram for babies or whatever.
Right.
But anyway, but I do feel like there was a lot of interesting instinct stuff that I didn't even get to put in the book. And I've kind of been a little, I got burned out with the instincts in a certain way.
Yeah.
And this
was that, like 6 years?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
that's a long time.
Yeah, and it's also just there's the burned out. It's not just a long time, but it's also kind of like, people who've read my book or listened to this really get the instincts, but outside of it, people are still kind of like, no, it's the passion instinct, or
right.
And there's a little bit like, God, like,
what are you gonna do to for get people to see things?
Yeah, like, I mean, I can explain like, well, it's called sexual, and there is obviously a big influence of sexuality in human personality. So it follows that there's something there's sexual instinct rooted in sexuality that we ought to pay attention to, and maybe these things we've been calling sexual are actually belong to social instinct. Blah blah blah. It's just like people stick with the first way they learn something. And I think that they I guess it's just like not wanting to feel wrong, or not wanting to feel that the resource that they feel loyalty to was wrong or something like this, or I don't know what it is, but it's just a mental rigidity.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about the last few months is just the concept of experiential blindness. That maybe a criticism of our group is that we're kind of throwing people into the deep end conceptually, and someone like Josh is very aware that people have to be brought along from step one before they can even do the deep heavy stuff. And I was thinking even about like something like typing, that Enneagram typing, at least the way we do it, that there is that there's an initial hump of experiential blindness that people have to overcome to even know that this is even a real thing that can happen.
Yeah.
So one of the unintended benefits of doing DAA is that I've noticed that none of the shitstorms happen in the group anymore, because people are getting to watch us sort of go through the process of doing these typings, and so they're getting to see how it's done, and that alone is sort of getting people to see, oh, this is a real thing, and these guys know how to do it. So let me just pay them to do it, because they kind of got into first base of like, oh, I see that these types are real, and I see how to observe them, which now they're not necessarily questioning if typing is even a thing, or our ability to do it. And so experiential blindness is something it's just a concept of like when something new comes around, like a new genre, like hip hop, when it first came around, like people didn't think it was music. And so there's like an experiential blindness for something like that. And one of the producers figured out that if they took Run DMC and they paired it with, I forget, was it like Run This Way, Come This Way? I forget the name of the band. But that they put rap on that song, and it became a huge Billboard hit, and it sort of introduced the general public to rap and to hip hop. And eventually a genre becomes standard, but it doesn't start out that way. And so it's like you have to give like attachment types like a landscape to attach to of precedents.
Yeah.
Build on precedents, and then it becomes adopted, and 10, 20 years goes by and then becomes the thing that everyone innately attaches to. And so I've been just thinking about how, we've kind of like laid the groundwork for the Enneagram, but kind of what we have to do now is sort of like bring people along in terms of different stages of awareness to overcome experiential blindness for over a period of time, because it doesn't happen overnight.
All right. Well, I'm pretty tired.
All right.
I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stuff here. It's not very coherent, but
I'll definitely fucking find a couple episodes out of this.
Cool. All right, man.
Nice. All right, man. I will talk to you later.
All right.